Sometimes transformation doesn't arrive with noise. It does not crash through the door of your life with fireworks or announcements. It arrives quietly, almost politely, like a gentle knock on the inside of your chest. And if you are not listening, you might miss it, because the most profound changes never shout, they whisper. They wait for stillness. This moment you are in right now, this subtle sense that something is shifting beneath the surface of your life is not accidental, it is not random. It is the moment right before the old version of you dissolves, not in violence, but in understanding. The old self never dies the way the ego imagines death. It does not perish in flames or collapse in failure. It fades, it loosens its grip, it becomes irrelevant. Like a coat you once needed in winter but now feels heavy and unnecessary in the warmth of spring. The old self was never wrong. It was never broken. It was simply temporary. It was a strategy. It was a response to fear, to conditioning, to moments when you forgot who you truly are, and now something deeper within you is saying very softly, you no longer need this. Growth does not begin when you add something new to yourself. Growth begins when you subtract what you were never meant to carry. The beliefs that told you you were small, the stories that told you you must struggle to be worthy, the habits that formed not out of love, but out of protection. The ego-built identity that learned how to survive, but never learned how to surrender. This is why the old self must fall away before growth begins. Because you cannot step into truth while clinging to armor you no longer need. You cannot hear the soul while the mind insists on being in control. The ego resists change because the ego equates familiarity with safety. Even when familiarity hurts, even when it limits you, even when it quietly drains your life of joy, the ego will say, at least I know this pain. At least I understand this disappointment. And so resistance is born, not because change is dangerous, but because the ego is afraid of becoming unnecessary. The ego does not want expansion. It wants continuity. It wants to remain the narrator of your life, even if the story has become cramped and repetitive. Resistance to change keeps you trapped in versions of yourself that once made sense, but no longer fit. It keeps you replaying old roles, old wounds, old reactions, long after their lesson has been learned. And you can feel this trap not as a dramatic crisis, but as a quiet restlessness, a sense that you are living slightly out of alignment. A feeling that you are doing everything you were taught to do, yet something essential is missing. This is not ingratitude, this is awareness, waking up. Transformation always announces itself first as discomfort, not the sharp pain of disaster, but the subtle ache of outgrowing your current shape. Like bones stretching in a growing child, there is pressure, there is unease, but there is also inevitability. You cannot stop it by tightening your grip. In fact, the more you resist, the more uncomfortable it becomes. The soul does not negotiate with fear. It waits patiently until you are ready to listen. There are spiritual signs that transformation is near, and they are rarely dramatic. You may find yourself losing interest in things that once consumed you. Conversations that once energized you now feel hollow. Achievements that once defined you no longer satisfy. You may feel drawn to silence, to solitude, to reflection. Not because you are withdrawing from life, but because you are being invited deeper into it. Old patterns begin to unravel. Relationships shift. Some fall away, not in conflict, but in completion. You start craving truth over approval, depth over distraction, meaning over momentum. You may also feel fear without a clear object, a vague anxiety that whispers, if I let go, who will I be? This is the ego sensing its own impermanence. It is the identity built on labels, roles, and past stories, realizing that it is not the author of your being. And this fear is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something real is approaching. The ego panics when it senses that awareness is taking the lead. Releasing fear does not mean eliminating it. It means seeing through it. Fear is always rooted in the future or the past. It is never present. In this moment, right now, there is no catastrophe. There is no loss of self. There is only awareness observing sensation. When you stay with the present, fear loses its narrative. It cannot survive without imagined outcomes. And as fear dissolves, control loosens its grip. Control is the ego's favorite illusion. It tells you that if you manage everything carefully enough, you will be safe. But control is not safety. Control is tension. It is the constant tightening of the jaw, the constant monitoring of outcomes, the constant belief that peace exists somewhere other than now. Letting go of control is not giving up. It is giving in to a deeper intelligence. It is trusting that the same force that beats your heart without instruction knows how to guide your life without force. The ego identity says, I am what I have achieved. I am what I own. I am what others think of me. The soul whispers, you are what is aware of all of that. You are not your past decisions. You are not your mistakes. You are not your titles, your roles, your productivity, or your failures. Those are experiences moving through you, not definitions of you. When you identify with the observer rather than the story, freedom begins quietly, without drama, without effort. Aligning with purpose does not require searching far and wide. Purpose is not a destination, it is a frequency. It is the feeling of being congruent with yourself. When your thoughts, actions, and values are in harmony, purpose is present. When you live from awareness rather than reaction, purpose is present. When you act from love rather than fear, purpose is present. You do not find purpose, you remember it. Inner peace is not the absence of challenge. It is the absence of resistance to what is. It is the ability to meet life as it unfolds without demanding that it conform to your preferences. Peace arises when you stop arguing with reality, when you stop saying this shouldn't be happening and start asking, what is this teaching me about who I am beyond this moment? Awareness does not eliminate pain, but it prevents suffering from becoming your identity. This is the quiet miracle of transformation. One day you realize you are no longer triggered by what once controlled you. You respond instead of react. You observe instead of defend. You choose instead of comply. Not because you force change, but because the old self simply no longer fits. The walls that once protected you now feel like cages. And so you step out, not with certainty, but with trust. You may grieve the old self. There may be moments of nostalgia, moments where you wonder if you are losing something familiar. But what you are losing is not your essence. You are losing the false contracts you made with fear. You are losing the belief that you must earn love. You are losing the idea that your worth is conditional. And what replaces it is not emptiness, but spaciousness. In that spaciousness, creativity flows, compassion deepens, forgiveness becomes natural, not as a moral obligation, but as an act of self-liberation. You realize that holding on to resentment only ties you to the very past you are trying to outgrow. There are no justified resentments when freedom is your priority. Forgiveness is not about excusing behavior. It is about releasing your energy from the prison of memory. As the old self dissolves, you do not become someone else. You become more yourself, more present, more alive, more attuned. You stop seeking validation from the outside because you are rooted on the inside. You stop chasing happiness because you recognize it as a byproduct of alignment, not an object to be acquired. You stop fearing stillness because you discover that silence is not empty, it is full of guidance. This moment, right before the old self dies, is sacred. It is tender. It is powerful. It asks for patience, not urgency, for curiosity, not judgment, for surrender, not effort. You do not need to know what comes next to trust that what is falling away was never meant to define you forever. Life is not taking something from you, it is making room. And so if you feel as though you are standing at an invisible threshold, uncertain but awake, know this: you are not lost. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are right on time. The quiet you feel is not absence, it is preparation. The dissolving you sense is not loss, it is liberation. And when the old self finally loosens its grip, you will not hear a crash. You will feel a lightness, a remembering, a gentle return to who you were before fear taught you to forget. Stay present. Stay open. Let the whisper guide you. This is not the end of who you are. It is the end of who you thought you had to be. And as this lightness settles in, something subtle yet unmistakable begins to happen. You start to notice that life is no longer something happening to you, but something unfolding through you. Events lose their sharp edges. Circumstances soften, not because the world has changed, but because the lens through which you see it has shifted. You are no longer gripping each moment with the clenched fist of expectation. You are allowing life to move, to breathe, to reveal itself without your constant supervision. And in that allowance, wisdom emerges naturally, without effort, without force. You realize that awareness is not passive, it is profoundly creative. What you place your attention on begins to expand, not as a mystical trick, but as a natural law of consciousness. When your attention is rooted in fear, fear multiplies. When your attention is rooted in gratitude, life responds in kind. This is not positive thinking. This is alignment. This is understanding that your inner state is the primary architect of your experience. The outer world has always been the echo, never the source. There comes a moment when you stop asking, "What should I do?" and begin asking, "Who am I being?" And in that shift, struggle loosens its grip. Action flows from clarity instead of compulsion. You no longer rush to prove, to compete, to defend. You move when it feels true. You pause when it feels necessary. You trust that stillness is not stagnation, but incubation. Seeds grow in silence. Souls do too. You begin to sense a quiet intelligence moving beneath the surface of everything. In the way opportunities arrive without strain. In the way the right words come when you stop rehearsing. In the way solutions appear when you release the need to control outcomes. This intelligence has always been there. It was never absent. It was simply obscured by noise, by urgency, by the belief that you were alone in figuring it all out. As you live from this deeper awareness, compassion naturally extends outward. You see others not as obstacles or mirrors of your insecurity, but as fellow travelers at different points along the same journey. Judgment dissolves because you recognize yourself in every human story. You understand that behavior is often the language of unmet needs, and that love is the only response that truly heals. This does not make you weak. It makes you clear. Clarity becomes your compass, not certainty. Certainty belongs to the ego. Clarity belongs to the soul. It is flexible. It listens. It adjusts. You learn that not knowing is not a flaw, but a doorway. Mystery is not something to be solved, but something to be lived. When you release the demand for guarantees, life reveals possibilities far greater than anything you could have planned. You also discover that joy is not a reaction to favorable conditions. It is a state of permission, a willingness to let life touch you without armor. Joy arises when you stop postponing happiness until everything is resolved. When you stop bargaining with the present moment. When you allow yourself to be fully here, fully alive, fully open, exactly as you are. Not someday. Now, the old habit of seeking validation from the outside fades quietly into irrelevance. Praise no longer inflates you. Criticism no longer defines you. You listen, you learn, but you are no longer dependent. Your sense of self is anchored somewhere deeper than opinion, somewhere unshakable. You know who you are because you have felt it, not because someone confirmed it. And perhaps the most profound realization of all begins to dawn. You were never meant to become perfect. You were meant to become whole. Wholeness includes light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, knowing and not knowing. It is the embrace of your humanity without losing sight of your divinity. When you stop trying to fix yourself, you create space to truly know yourself. And in knowing yourself, love becomes effortless. Life begins to feel less like a test and more like a conversation. Less like a race and more like a rhythm. You sense when to move and when to rest. When to speak and when to remain silent. You honor your energy instead of forcing it. You trust your intuition instead of overriding it. This trust is not blind. It is earned through presence, through listening, through honoring the quiet truths that arise when the mind is no longer shouting. And so the transformation continues, not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a gentle remembering. You remember what it feels like to be connected, to be guided, to be supported by something larger than your personal will. You remember that you are not separate from life. You are life expressing itself in a unique and unrepeatable way. There is nothing you need to chase to complete this journey. Nothing you need to become. Nothing you need to prove. The becoming happens naturally when you stop resisting who you already are. The path unfolds when you stop demanding that it look a certain way. Trust replaces effort. Presence replaces fear. And in this quiet unfolding, you realize that the old self did not disappear. It simply stepped aside, allowing the truth of you to finally take the lead. And with that truth gently leading, you begin to sense a profound intimacy with existence itself. Life no longer feels like a series of hurdles to clear or problems to solve, but like a relationship that deepens the more you listen. You feel spoken to in subtle ways, in the timing of a pause, in the unexpected calm that arrives after uncertainty, in the quiet reassurance that you are being carried even when you do not know where you are going. This intimacy does not demand belief. It invites experience. It asks only that you remain available to what is unfolding. You notice how effort transforms into ease when action arises from alignment rather than fear. Tasks that once felt heavy now feel purposeful. Decisions once clouded by doubt become simple, not because they are easy, but because they are honest. You stop negotiating with your intuition. You no longer need to justify what feels right. There is a deep relief in no longer betraying yourself for approval, in no longer silencing your inner knowing for the sake of comfort or conformity. Time itself seems to soften. You are less haunted by what has passed and less anxious about what might come. The present moment expands, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. You begin to understand that now is not a fleeting point between past and future. It is the only place life actually happens. And when you inhabit it fully, you discover that peace has been waiting here all along. You become more patient, not because you are trying to be virtuous, but because urgency no longer drives you. You trust the intelligence of timing. You understand that forcing outcomes is a form of resistance, and that resistance is simply fear disguised as effort. When you release the need to rush, life meets you with surprising generosity. Doors open without struggle. Conversations heal without rehearsed speeches. Answers arrive when questions are held gently rather than demanded. There is also a deepening tenderness toward yourself. You no longer view your missteps as evidence of failure, but as moments of learning shaped by where you were conscious at the time. Self-compassion replaces self-criticism. You see that growth was never about becoming flawless. It was about becoming aware. And awareness is forgiving by nature. It understands context. It dissolves shame by shining light on it. As this compassion grows inward, it radiates outward effortlessly. You listen more deeply. You interrupt less. You feel less compelled to be right and more interested in being present. You recognize that connection does not come from convincing others, but from meeting them without pretense. You realize that the greatest gift you offer the world is not your performance, but your presence. There is a quiet courage that emerges now, not the loud bravery of confrontation, but the steady courage of authenticity. You speak truth without aggression. You set boundaries without guilt. You honor your energy without apology. This courage is rooted in self-respect, not defiance. It does not seek validation. It simply stands grounded and clear in what it knows to be true. And somewhere along the way, you stop measuring your life by external milestones. Success is no longer defined by accumulation or recognition, but by congruence, by how often you feel at peace within yourself, by how freely love moves through you, by how lightly you hold what once felt so heavy. You begin to sense that fulfillment is not something you arrive at. It is something you allow. The fear of loss diminishes as you understand that nothing essential can be taken from you. Forms may change. Relationships may evolve. Circumstances may shift. But what you are at the core remains untouched. Awareness does not age. Presence does not diminish. Love does not disappear. When you know this, not as an idea, but as an experience, attachment loosens naturally. You enjoy without clinging. You appreciate without possessing. You participate without needing to control. This is where freedom quietly reveals itself, not as independence from life, but as intimacy with it. You are free because you are no longer arguing with reality, free because you no longer outsource your worth, free because you trust the unfolding even when the path is not visible. This freedom does not isolate you. It connects you more deeply than ever before. And so the journey continues, moment by moment, breath by breath, not towards some distant ideal, but deeper into what is already here, each step guided not by fear, but by awareness. Each choice shaped not by habit, but by presence. You are not becoming something new. You are shedding what was never truly you. And in this shedding, in this gentle, ongoing surrender, life begins to move through you with a grace that feels both unfamiliar and utterly natural, as if you are finally remembering how to trust the current that has always known the way. And as you rest into that current, something even more delicate begins to surface, a quiet reverence for being alive that does not depend on circumstance. You start to notice the way breath arrives without instruction, how the body knows how to heal itself, how the heart continues to open even after it has been wounded. There is an intelligence at work that has never abandoned you, not once, not even in your most confused moments. You sense now that every detour, every pause, every seeming setback was part of a larger orchestration guiding you back to awareness. You stop asking life to make sense according to old rules. You stop insisting that everything be explained before you can trust it. Trust begins to precede understanding. You feel it in your body first, as a loosening, as a softening around the edges of effort. The mind may still search for answers, but it no longer dominates the experience. It becomes a useful instrument rather than a demanding master. And in that shift, clarity feels less like certainty and more like resonance. You begin to live from a place where gratitude is no longer a practice but a perception. You see how much has been holding you all along. How often you were supported in ways you never noticed because you were too focused on what was missing. Gratitude now arises naturally, not as a polite response, but as recognition. Recognition that life has always been conspiring in your favor, even when it did not look the way you expected. The past loses its emotional charge. Memories still exist, but they no longer pull you backward. They become stories without hooks, lessons without weight. You understand that revisiting the past only has power when it is used as an identity. When you release that identification, the past transforms from a prison into a teacher. It shows you how far awareness has traveled, how much has already been integrated, how resilient the soul truly is. You also notice a growing comfort with uncertainty. Where once ambiguity created anxiety, it now creates openness. You realize that the unknown is not empty, it is fertile. It is where creativity lives. It is where guidance enters. When you stop filling every space with prediction and worry, life has room to surprise you. And surprise, you discover, is one of the most sacred experiences of all. The urge to compare quietly dissolves. You no longer measure your journey against anyone else's timeline. You recognize that comparison was never about others. It was about forgetting your own wholeness. Now you see that every path is unique because every expression of life is unique. There is no competition in consciousness. There is only expression unfolding in countless forms. Moments of silence become nourishing rather than uncomfortable. You find yourself drawn to stillness not as an escape, but as a homecoming. In silence, there is no performance, no narrative, no expectation. There is only being. And in that being, you feel more connected than ever before, not isolated, but integrated. You sense that stillness is not the absence of life, but its source. The body begins to respond to this inner alignment. Tension releases where it once lived unnoticed. Breathing deepens, movements soften. You listen more attentively to signals that were once overridden by urgency. Rest becomes an act of wisdom rather than indulgence. You honor cycles instead of resisting them. You understand that renewal requires pause, and that honoring your limits is an expression of self-respect. There is a gentle humility that accompanies this stage of awakening. Not the humility of diminishment, but the humility of awe. Awe at the vastness you are part of. Awe at the simplicity underlying complexity. Awe at the realization that you do not have to carry the weight of the universe on your shoulders. You are a participant, not the controller. A vessel, not the source. And this realization brings immense relief. You no longer feel compelled to define yourself so tightly. Labels fall away. Stories loosen. You allow yourself to be fluid, responsive, alive. You see that identity was never meant to be a fixed structure. It was meant to be a doorway. And now that you have passed through it, you do not need to keep standing in the frame. Life feels more intimate now, more immediate. You notice small moments with reverence, the way light moves across a room, the sound of your own footsteps, the quiet kindness in ordinary exchanges. Nothing feels insignificant anymore. Everything carries presence. Everything feels infused with meaning, not because you assign it, but because you are fully there to receive it. And as this awareness continues to deepen, you realize something profound. The transformation you thought was coming has already arrived, not as a finished state, but as a way of being. The old self did not vanish overnight. It gently dissolved as truth took its place. What remains is not a new identity, but a living openness, a willingness to meet each moment without armor, a trust in the unfolding that does not require guarantees. This is the quiet continuity of awakening. Not an ending, not a climax, but an ongoing return to presence. Each breath an invitation, each moment a fresh beginning. You are not walking toward life anymore. You are standing inside it. And from this place, everything flows naturally, effortlessly, exactly as it was always meant to. There is a quiet misunderstanding that has followed humanity for a very long time. A misunderstanding so subtle that it hides inside our everyday language, inside the way we praise and criticize one another, inside the way we define what it means to be intelligent, successful, or awake. We are taught from the moment we can speak that to be thoughtful is a virtue and to be thoughtless is a flaw, a failing of character, an absence of care. And yet, if you sit with this word gently, if you hold it not with judgment but with curiosity, you may begin to sense that there is a deeper invitation hidden inside it. What if thoughtlessness, in its purest sense, is not the absence of love, but the absence of fear? What if it is not emptiness, but freedom? What if being thoughtless, in the spiritual sense, is not a deficit, but a return? You see, most of us live our lives inside a constant stream of thought, a relentless inner commentary that narrates, evaluates, compares, regrets, anticipates, and rehearses. This voice speaks from the moment we wake until long after we should be resting. It tells us who we are, who we should be, what went wrong yesterday, and what might go wrong tomorrow. And because it speaks so persistently, we mistake it for ourselves. We believe that the thinker of the thoughts is who we are, and so we live as if our identity depends on keeping that voice alive, busy, relevant, and in control. We polish it, defend it, justify it. We call this activity being thoughtful, and we reward it endlessly. But beneath this noise, beneath the constant movement of the mind, there is a deeper presence that has never needed to speak to be real. There is an awareness that existed before your first thought and will remain after your last. It does not argue or analyze. It does not label or condemn. It simply is. And when you touch this place, even for a moment, something extraordinary happens. The weight you have been carrying, often without realizing it, begins to dissolve. The need to prove, to defend, to replay, to control softens. And in that softening, you discover a freedom that no external achievement could ever provide. Being thoughtless, in this sense, does not mean being careless or unconscious. It means being free from the tyranny of compulsive thinking. It means no longer allowing the mind to dominate the soul. It is the difference between using the mind as a tool and being used by it. The mind is a beautiful servant, but it makes a very poor master. And most of the suffering we experience comes not from life itself, but from the endless commentary we attach to life. Think of how often you revisit moments that have already passed, replaying conversations, reimagining outcomes, punishing yourself with words that no one else is speaking anymore. The past, which has no physical existence, becomes a living force inside you because thought keeps resurrecting it. Or consider how often you live ahead of yourself, rehearsing futures that have not yet arrived, borrowing worry from days that may never come. In both cases, the present moment, the only place where life is actually happening, is quietly overlooked. Thoughtlessness is an invitation back into now. And the now is where freedom lives. Not as a concept, not as an idea, but as an experience. When the mind becomes still, even briefly, you can feel it. A subtle spaciousness opens inside you. The body relaxes, the breath deepens, and there is a sense, perhaps unfamiliar at first, of being at home within yourself. This is not something you achieve. It is something you remember. The ego, that collection of beliefs and stories about who you think you are, survives entirely on thought. It needs comparison to exist. It needs labels, successful or unsuccessful, right or wrong, better or worse. It feeds on judgment, especially self-judgment. and it is terrified of silence. Because in silence, it has nothing to say. When you stop thinking compulsively, the ego loosens its grip. It does not disappear in a dramatic moment, but it becomes less convincing, less urgent. You begin to see it for what it is, a pattern, not an identity. And here is where the great healing begins. Because so much of what we call emotional pain is actually the result of believing our thoughts without question. A thought arises, I am not enough. I failed. They hurt me. I will never be happy. And because we identify with it, the body responds as if it were an absolute truth. Muscles tighten, the heart contracts, energy drains away. Yet a thought, no matter how familiar, is still just a thought. It has no inherent power until you give it belief. When you practice thoughtlessness not as an act of force, but as an act of gentle awareness, you create space between the thought and the one who notices it. You become the observer rather than the prisoner. And in that space, you gain choice. You may still think, but thinking is no longer happening to you. It is happening through you. You can allow a thought to pass like a cloud across the sky of your awareness without building a home inside it. This is why forgiveness becomes natural in a thoughtless state. Resentment requires memory, story, and repetition. It requires the mind to keep a record of wrongs, to replay images of injury, to sustain an identity of victimhood. When thought quiets, resentment has nowhere to land. Forgiveness is not something you force yourself to do. It is something that happens when the mind stops insisting on being right. And in that release, you discover that forgiveness is not about letting someone else off the hook. It is about freeing yourself from a burden you were never meant to carry. There is a profound intelligence in life itself, an organizing principle that moves galaxies and grows trees and beats your heart without your permission or planning. This same intelligence lives within you. It does not require your anxious supervision. It does not need your constant evaluation. When you step out of the way, when you become, in the truest sense, thoughtless, you allow this intelligence to guide you. Decisions become clearer, not because you have analyzed them more thoroughly, but because you are listening more deeply. You may notice that your most peaceful moments have never come from intense thinking. They have come while watching a sunset, holding a child, walking in nature, or losing yourself in music. In those moments, you were not trying to solve yourself. You were simply present. And presence is the gateway to peace. Presence is what remains when thought rests. This does not mean abandoning responsibility or becoming indifferent to life. On the contrary, when you are free from compulsive thought, you respond to life more effectively. You listen better. You act with clarity rather than reactivity. Compassion arises naturally because you are no longer filtering everything through the lens of me. You begin to sense that the same awareness looking out through your eyes is looking out through every other pair of eyes as well. Separation softens. Unity becomes felt, not theorized. To live thoughtlessly is to trust that you are already enough. The need to constantly improve, fix, or justify yourself comes from a belief in deficiency. But when you rest in awareness, you discover that your value is not something you earn through performance or thought. It is inherent. It is present before any label is applied. You do not need to think yourself into worthiness. You are worthy by virtue of being. And so the invitation is simple, though not always easy. Notice your thoughts without becoming them. Allow silence without rushing to fill it. When the mind insists on its stories, meet it with kindness rather than resistance. Over time, you will find that the gaps between thoughts grow longer, more spacious. In those gaps, life reveals itself as it truly is, whole, intelligent, and benevolent. Being called thoughtless in this light is no longer an insult. It is a compliment of the highest order. It suggests a person who has stepped beyond the noise, who has tasted the freedom that lies beyond the mind's endless commentary. It suggests a soul that has remembered its source. And as you move through your days, you may find yourself returning again and again to this simple truth. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which they appear. When you live from this knowing, freedom is no longer something you seek. It is something you are. And from this place of remembering, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself, something that cannot be grasped by effort or achieved through discipline, because it arrives only when striving relaxes. You begin to notice that life no longer feels like something you are pushing against or racing to catch up with. Instead, it feels as though you are being carried. Not carried in a passive way, but in a deeply participatory flow, like a river that knows exactly where it is going without ever consulting a map. You realize that the struggle you once believed was necessary for growth was often just resistance to what already was. In this softened awareness, you may find that old identities lose their sharp edges. The labels you once defended so fiercely, your roles, your accomplishments, your failures begin to feel lighter, less permanent. They still exist, but they no longer define the core of you. You wear them the way the sky wears clouds, allowing them to appear and disappear without confusion about what remains when they are gone. This is not detachment from life, it is intimacy with it, free of possession. There is a quiet courage that emerges here, a courage that does not announce itself or seek validation. It is the courage to be present with uncertainty without immediately turning it into a problem. It is the courage to feel deeply without needing to explain or protect every emotion. When thought loosens its grip, fear loses its favorite hiding place. Fear depends on projection, on imagined futures and remembered wounds. In the stillness of now, fear has no story to tell. And something remarkable happens to your sense of time. Moments stretch open. You notice textures, tones, subtle movements you once rushed past. Life begins to feel richer, not because it has changed, but because you are no longer filtering it through constant evaluation. The simple act of breathing becomes a quiet miracle. The ordinary reveals itself as sacred. You no longer search for meaning as something separate from experience. Meaning is felt directly in the act of being alive. From this space, love arises without conditions. Not the kind of love that negotiates or demands, but a steady warmth that flows outward naturally. When you are not consumed with your own thoughts, you have room for others. You listen without rehearsing your response. You give without calculating return. Compassion stops being a moral obligation and becomes an effortless expression of who you are. You recognize yourself in others, not as an idea, but as a lived truth. This is where healing deepens beyond the personal story. You may notice that even the body responds to this inner quiet. Tension eases where it once lingered. Energy moves more freely. The nervous system, no longer braced for imagined threats, remembers how to rest. Healing does not arrive as a dramatic event, but as a gradual rebalancing, a return to harmony that was always waiting beneath the noise. You may still encounter challenges because life does not promise a world without contrast. But your relationship to difficulty changes. Problems no longer define you, they inform you. You meet them with curiosity rather than panic, with presence rather than resistance. Thought becomes a resource you can access when needed, not a constant background hum you cannot escape. You think when it serves clarity, and you rest when it does not. And perhaps the most profound realization of all begins to dawn gently without fanfare. You were never meant to think your way into peace. Peace is not a conclusion the mind reaches. It is the ground beneath the mind. It is what remains when the commentary pauses. It is the silent yes that life is always offering, moment by moment, regardless of circumstances. So you walk forward differently now. Not faster, not slower, but more aligned. You trust the intelligence that breathes you, that beats your heart, that has carried you through every moment of your life without needing your approval. You stop interfering so much with your own becoming. You allow yourself to be guided by something deeper than analysis, something wiser than fear. And in this allowing, you come to understand that true freedom was never about controlling your thoughts, but about no longer being controlled by them. It was about recognizing that the deepest truths do not shout, they whisper. They wait patiently beneath the surface of thinking, ready to be heard the moment you stop insisting on your own noise. This is the gift hidden inside thoughtlessness, not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but presence, not losing yourself, but finally meeting who you have always been. And as this meeting deepens, you may begin to sense that what you once called your life is not a series of disconnected events, but a single intelligent movement unfolding with exquisite precision. Even the moments you labeled as mistakes, detours, or losses begin to glow with a different meaning. They were not interruptions to your path. They were the path shaping your capacity to awaken, softening the places where rigidity once lived. When thought relaxes, regret loosens its hold, and gratitude quietly takes its place, not as a forced attitude, but as a natural recognition of how perfectly everything has served your remembering. You may notice now that silence is no longer uncomfortable. It no longer feels like something is missing. Instead, silence becomes a companion, a gentle presence that steadies you amid the noise of the world. You find yourself returning to it throughout the day, sometimes in the space between breaths, sometimes in the pause before a response, sometimes simply by noticing the aliveness that hums beneath everything. In these moments, you are not withdrawing from life, you are touching its source. And with this touch comes a humility that is profoundly liberating. The need to be special, to stand apart, to prove uniqueness through effort and comparison begins to fade. You realize that your true magnificence was never about being different from life, but about being an expression of it. Just as a wave does not need to declare its importance to the ocean, you do not need to announce your worth to existence. You belong by nature, not by achievement. This understanding gently reshapes how you move through relationships. You stop trying to fix others or complete yourself through them. You allow people to be where they are, just as you are learning to allow yourself. Love becomes spacious, uncluttered by expectation. You discover that presence is the greatest gift you can offer, your full attention, unfiltered by judgment or agenda. In this presence, healing occurs without instruction. Hearts soften simply by being seen. There is also a newfound tenderness toward your own humanity. You no longer demand perfection from yourself. When emotions arise, sadness, frustration, uncertainty, you meet them with compassion rather than resistance. You understand now that emotions are not obstacles to awakening, they are visitors passing through awareness. When you do not cling to them with thought, they complete their natural cycle and dissolve, leaving behind wisdom rather than scars. And so life begins to feel less like a problem to be solved and more like a mystery to be lived. You do not need to understand everything to trust it. You do not need guarantees to move forward. Faith in this sense is not belief in a particular outcome, it is confidence in the intelligence that animates all outcomes. It is the quiet knowing that whatever unfolds will carry you deeper into truth if you remain present. As this trust grows, you may find yourself acting with greater ease and effectiveness, even though you are thinking less. Inspiration replaces deliberation. Action arises spontaneously from clarity rather than compulsion. You speak when words are needed, and you remain silent when silence serves. Life feels less exhausting because you are no longer fighting its current. You are cooperating with it. And in this cooperation, joy emerges not as excitement dependent on circumstances, but as a steady undercurrent of aliveness. Joy becomes your natural state when you are not arguing with reality through thought. It is the joy of being aligned with what is, of sensing the sacredness in each ordinary moment. Even in the midst of challenge, this joy remains accessible, not as denial, but as depth. You begin to see that awakening is not a destination you reach one day, but a way of inhabiting each moment. It is choosing presence again and again. It is remembering gently whenever you forget. And forgetting, you now understand, is not a failure. It is simply part of the rhythm of being human. Each return to awareness strengthens your trust in it. And so you continue, not striving to become someone else, but relaxing into who you already are. You allow thought to come and go, like weather passing through a vast sky. You rest more often in the space that remains unchanged. In that space, you are free, not because life has become perfect, but because you are no longer confusing your thoughts about life with life itself. This is the quiet revolution of the soul. It does not shout or demand attention. It unfolds softly, steadily, transforming everything not by force, but by presence. And as you live from this place, you realize that freedom was never something you had to earn or achieve. It was waiting patiently beneath your thoughts, ready to be lived the moment you stop believing that thinking was who you are. And from this lived freedom, something even more expansive begins to take shape, not as an idea you grasp, but as a way the world starts to meet you differently. You notice that circumstances seem less adversarial, less charged with personal meaning. Events arrive and pass without clinging to your identity. Praise no longer inflates you, and criticism no longer collapses you, because both require a self-image to attach themselves to. In their absence, you remain steady, rooted in something deeper than approval or disapproval. There is a simplicity that emerges now, a quiet elegance in how you move through the day. You do fewer things, but you do them with greater presence. The mind no longer racing ahead or dragging behind, aligns with the rhythm of the moment. You find yourself arriving fully wherever you are, and this arrival transforms ordinary actions into living meditations. Washing a dish, opening a door, listening to a friend, each becomes complete in itself, no longer a means to an imagined end. You begin to sense that life has always been communicating with you, not through words, but through feeling, intuition, and resonance. When the mind quiets, this language becomes unmistakable. You feel a subtle pull toward certain choices, a gentle resistance toward others. This is not impulse or emotion, it is alignment. It is the intelligence of the soul guiding you with precision that thinking could never replicate. You learn to trust this guidance, not because it guarantees comfort, but because it consistently leads you toward truth. And with this trust comes a release of control that feels both vulnerable and liberating. You stop gripping outcomes so tightly. You allow situations to unfold without micromanaging every detail. Paradoxically, life begins to cooperate with you more fully when you stop trying to dominate it. Doors open without force. Solutions appear without struggle. You realize that control was never the source of your safety. Awareness was. This awareness also changes how you relate to uncertainty. What once felt threatening now feels spacious. You no longer rush to fill the unknown with conclusions. You allow questions to remain open, trusting that clarity will arrive in its own time. In this openness, creativity flows. New possibilities emerge, not from effort, but from receptivity. The mind becomes fertile rather than frantic. You may also notice a deepening sense of reverence for life itself, not as a belief system or doctrine, but as a lived appreciation for the mystery animating everything. You feel it in the way light falls across a room, in the cadence of your breath, in the quiet resilience of your own heart. Awe becomes a daily companion, not because the world has become extraordinary, but because you are no longer numb to its wonder. And in this reverence, the illusion of separation continues to dissolve. You see that what you once called others are not truly outside you. Their joys and sorrows echo within the same field of awareness you inhabit. Compassion deepens not as an obligation, but as a recognition. You respond to suffering not with pity, but with presence. You understand now that being fully here with someone is often the most powerful form of healing. This presence extends inward as well. You no longer abandon yourself in moments of discomfort. When pain arises, you stay. You breathe, you listen. And in staying, you discover that pain, when met without thought, reveals its impermanence. It moves, shifts, transforms. It teaches, then releases. What remains is a deeper trust in your capacity to meet life as it is. And so the journey continues, not as a climb toward some distant peak, but as a deepening into this moment. Each breath becomes an invitation to return. Each pause becomes a doorway. You no longer measure your progress by how often you think, but by how often you remember to rest in the space between thoughts. This is not a withdrawal from the world, but a fuller participation in it. You engage without entanglement. You care without clinging. You act without losing yourself in action. Life flows through you with increasing ease, and you discover that this flow has always been available. And as you live from this place, the idea of freedom transforms once more. It is no longer something you seek or defend. It is simply the natural expression of a mind at rest in awareness. A life lived in alignment with its own deepest truth.